welcome back to my author commentary for A Prince of Song and Shade. Today we are up to chapter 17, which starts introducing a lot of intrigue and mystery into the story. And while chapters 17 and 18 are both our two protagonists' kind of viewpoints on what happens in this chapter, so I'm going to combine them together into this author commentary so we can talk about both how Talyn and the Shadowhawk / Kewin react to this horrible murder that happens up in the Citadel. So yes, chapter 17, it kicks off with Talyn training with Tiercelin. She's back to kind of tutoring him one-on-one now that she's back in with Rhaena. Not only just helping him with his shield, but he's now helping her train in terms of starting to utilize potentially some of the warrior magic that she has. She's quite surprised at his lack of questions, especially now that he knows that she does have winged folk. I think knowing Tiercelin's natural curiosity and kind of academic bent, she expected him to have a lot of questions about her and what her capabilities might be, but doesn't get any. But the real point of this scene, the real touching part of this scene is that Talyn finally gets an answer about why Sari is still in her head. And it's kind of possibly the best answer she could ever have gotten. And Tiercelin's explanation for it really rings true. Cullinan partners do bond quite closely. They're a pair for a reason. It's not just a thing that's written down in the Cullinan registers that two warriors decide to pair together. There is more to it than that. It does have to do with the magic that they share. And the fact that Sari died so suddenly without time for anyone to prepare, that bond was essentially torn apart. And it makes perfect sense, as Tiercelin explained, that parts of Sari would still be there, just as much as the parts of Talyn that might have been in Sari are now gone. And that explains also some of the changes in her since Sari's death. So while he then offers proper kind of winged folk healing on that wounded scar that's still inside her, she says no to that. She feels like the healing journey she's on, even though it's incredibly difficult, is one that she wants to take without kind of magically removing that pain. I think she feels like that having Sari in her head and that pain, they're all interlinked, and she wants to hold on to as much of her partner as she can. And that's the decision she makes. After that scene, obviously, Ravnia comes to Talyn in the middle of the Wolves drill training. He wants her opinion on something that's happened in the Citadel. She brings along Zamoral, which turns out to be a good decision. Also, Goldfeather has been murdered horribly in his quarters, and also found at the scene nearby, equally horribly murdered, is Idrian Iceflight. Talyn is obviously quite shocked to come into the room and see such gory, blood-splattered, gore-splattered room, walls and bodies, but quickly realizes that the reason Ravnia really brought her there is to have his secretary, Ferris Grasswing, my apologies, who is a song mage, read her reaction to see whether she might have had anything to do with those murders, which she's rightly infuriated by, as is Zamoral, but their reactions are quite genuine, and Ravnia quickly dismisses any suspicions he might have had, and then genuinely kind of asks her to help, knowing her Cullinan background. And this is a fun way, I thought this scene was a really fun way to show Talyn's non-combat skills. Cullinan aren't just elite warriors, they're not just there to go and fight things. In times of peace, they're also a law enforcement unit. They spend a lot of time investigating things, going undercover, all that sort of thing. And Talyn has a lot of those skills too. She and Sari are incredibly good at their jobs, and not just because they were elite fighters, but because they were really good at the investigation parts too. And she and Zamoral working together, as well as Sari and Talyn said, quickly pick up things that the Falcons don't. For example, that it was an animal that's caused those wounds on both bodies, that Idrian hadn't drawn his sword or even attempted to do so, despite being attacked by what was presumably a vicious Torncat. And those things are very important to understand what is going on, or at least to give them a starting point for investigating who might have been behind the murders. The final thing that Talyn picks up in this scene is when she and Zamoral are searching the grounds outside the tower, or outside also Goldfeather's quarters, is that she finds that pendant, the crossed knives. That is something that a shadow wears. We don't hear her say that in her head, but it's clear in this chapter that she recognizes it, and she starts putting some things together in relation to Sarvan, which we'll see that interaction in an upcoming chapter. But for her, from Talyn's perspective, she's got two dead bodies two men that weren't necessarily associated with each other in any obvious way, murdered by a Tawnchat, which everyone tells her cannot be directed or controlled by a human, a Shadowhawk's arrow left at the scene, a shadow pendant in the garden outside. There's a whole bunch of red herrings in this chapter, in this scene, and it's a big mystery that she and Zamrul and the Shadowhawk have to solve. I'll touch a little bit more on this when I talk on the next chapter, but as we know, Azralan was behind this murder. He is the one that controls the wild Tawnchat. And also Goldfeather, who we last saw in an earlier scene with Kewin arguing with Azralan. It's no coincidence that he's now ended up quite horribly murdered. There's a pretty pertinent question that is asked in these chapters around why do it so horribly, and there is certainly a theatre aspect to this as well. Azralan's motivations are multiple. His plans are very well thought out. They have many layers, and they kind of tick off a few different boxes with each plan that he makes in this case. It's not just about framing the Shadowhawk. It's not just about getting rid of Goldfeather and Idrian Iceflight, who are working against him potentially, or at least warning Mathanas that something was up. But it's also about creating fear and unease amongst the winged folk population. If a Tawnchat can get up and murder a council member, then none of them are safe, and that's also about unseating his mother. So like I said, many layers to Azralan's plans. We then switch into chapter 18, which is Kewin's take on this whole thing, because Mathanas comes and drags him out of his room to come see this. Now, again, I've talked about this. Mathanas is painted as the big villain in this series. He is a horrible person. I won't make any argument about that. But his first instinct is to drag both his brothers to this scene because he is a prince of Mithrena. He feels responsible for ruling the country. And while he doesn't do that in a particularly nice way or give a shit about any of his human subjects, he is concerned about what this murder means. And he feels like his brothers need to be there to help sort out whatever the situation might be. Obviously, the biggest introduction in this chapter is Jasper. We get our first introduction to the little Tawnchat kitten that Kewin drags out from under the bed and saves from being drowned by Mathanas. And then poor Andros Ty at the end of this chapter has to kind of help him figure out whether little Tawncat's all right and what to get him to eat. But Jasper is one of my absolute favourite characters in this series. He is named Jasper because a good friend of mine owns a Jasper, not a Tawnchat, a puppy, but that's how Jasper got his name. I can rave about Jasper for many chapters, but I'll leave that there. He's just incredibly awesome, and he gets better and better and better as an animal character as this series progresses, and he's so much fun to write. There are some other interesting little hints in this scene, one of which is this scene is written very much to kind of have the reader feel sympathetic towards Azralan. There's a few little quiet moments between him and Kewin in this chapter where it feels like he's being a nice brother. He gives Kewin a little smile. They kind of roll their eyes at each other about how angry and scowling Mathanas is as he paces around the room and yells at them. But there's a couple other things that if you're really paying attention, are quite interesting here. One is that when Kewin first enters the room with Mathanas, Azralan is completely calm and remains that way throughout the entire scene. He's not even a little bit bothered by the gore around him, by the dead bodies. Even Mathanas is affected. That comes out in anger and paranoia, but Mathanas is even affected by this, not just the bodies in the room, but what it might mean. But again, absolutely no reaction from Azralan, which Kewin doesn't really think about, but possibly should. The other is the very subtle tell in this scene that Azralan is using song magic to calm Mathanas. And if you go and reread that chapter, hopefully you can spot that in there now. You know that it's there. But we focus very much in this book, and even more so in A King of Masks and Magic, how Kewin constantly uses his song magic to keep himself safe. Azralan does exactly the same thing, and no one ever thinks about the fact that if Kewin's doing it, others might be as well, and Azralan is, and you can see the little hints of that in this chapter. We also get another interesting insight into Mathanas. Again, he's a horrible person. He's incredibly paranoid. He's always in a bad temper. But again, as I was saying earlier, he's not wrong here. This is a serious threat, or could develop into one, and he's onto that pretty quickly. So he's no fool, even if he does come across as someone who's a bit too bad-tempered to really have a good thought in his head. So yes, chapters 17 and 18, we now have a murder mystery in the Citadel. I loved writing that. And as I said, I loved being able to showcase Talyn's other talents. It's not just about her being able to fight well. And then drop in those little hints too about Azralan and Mathanas. And of course, introducing the best animal character ever, Jasper. So I hope you enjoyed those chapters too. I hope you enjoyed this author commentary. If you've got any further questions, please drop them in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer. Otherwise, I really look forward to seeing you in chapter 19, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.